Every 2 seconds, one person is displaced from their home. The clock is ticking, but is global action keeping up with the needs of refugees escaping conflict and persecution? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Ghida Fakhry. Global mass migration is at a record high. More people have been uprooted by war, violence and persecution than any other time since World War II. The world took notice of the plight of refugees after Syrians began streaming into Europe in 2015. But while refugees are no longer appearing in the headlines, their plight endures. Refugees from Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan and many other countries continue to wait in refugee camps where food is scarce, access to education is limited and jobs are hard to come by. Countries bordering conflict zones, mostly developing nations, are the first responders. But resources are tight, and now with nationalism and xenophobia on the rise, wealthy nations, even those with a direct role in the conflicts these refugees are escaping, are closing the door. The Rohingya are one of those groups. Hundreds of thousands have sought refuge at a camp in Bangladesh, and that is where we begin.
बर्बाद मजे आर हाड़ी गलार तो मारी गलार गौर पूरा दिवल ये तिया नल्ला बिले आरा माने था ये मुरा माजे आरा एमएस डरमाल लेते अच्छी लाम तो आवी चम्मा तो आरा माने मुरा तो होतो बहुत हॉस्टल बिस्टो करिए जरूर माजे बिजू पूरी आरा अच्छी है एकोला यार बाद आरा माने एडो मार दिवस फल हॉस्टल भाई बाद आरा एडो माने सरहार दिए सरहार ये बाद आरा या माने बिलागर तक की दे दिया ada bila hostel dia
आरारे मिलिटारी दूरा ये दे थाने खरीरा आगे के दे तो ले आरार माँ बहनों रेप गोरी मारी फैलाइए तो ले आरार गुरा गरा फंक्शन हाड़ी फैलाइए मारी फैलाइए आरार दादा दादी मारी फैलाइए तो পর্যন্ত আরারে ফন্ডার স্কুলের দিনে হারির ফটাকারে নেলতো নদের বাজ্যা বাজ্যা গুনারি লো জিয়ল গলাদের তো লে পর্যন্ত তো আরা তা তো সাই বাদাত করি না হারা বরখা দেখা যায় বাংলাদেশের মধ্যে আরারে ফারগারা দি ফেলাই তো লে আরা তো নিজের ঘর বাড়ি ফেলি একাম ফর ভিতরে আরা তো তা করে
We are Rohingya living here in the camp. It's very hard to live as a human, and it's unbearable situation for us to live. We want to convince America and China and to convince to Myanmar to give our rights. In Myanmar, there is many religions living as a human. Why Rohingya cannot live there? We Rohingya have the right to get our citizenship, have the right to get our properties, and if America and China help us, that will be very thankful.
So then, a cry for help from a refugee camp. But what is the responsibility of the United States and other global powers to ensure that refugees like the Rohingya can forge a dignified future? I'm joined by Eric Schwartz, President of Refugees International and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees and Migration. Eric Schwartz, I know you were at the refugee camp, Cox's Bazar, not too long ago. You heard what some of the Rohingya refugees have been telling us. There are now about 1 million people in Bangladesh. For them, there is no return in sight, yet they have been crying for help, crying for the U.S. and other big powers like China to do more, to intervene, to help them. Why are we hearing such a deafening silence?
Well, I have never witnessed a humanitarian situation as dire as this one when we went to the camps. The mass of humanity that were forced into Bangladesh, a really terrible situation, thousands of people killed. The solution here ultimately, the preferred solution is return in dignity and safety to Burma, to Myanmar.
But that's not going to happen, is it?
No.
Is it realistic?
Well, it's not going to happen if the international community, if powerful governments of the world continue to respond the way they've been responding. The United States, Vice President Pence spoke out last year in a meeting where Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the Burmese government, was present. Vice President Pence made a statement at the UN some time back, but the President of the United States hasn't said a thing about this issue.
He hasn't said a thing. There was no single presidential tweet on this ongoing crisis, yet the evidence is there.
Yeah.
The US's own investigation, the US's government's investigation over a year ago found that Myanmar's military, quote, waged a well-planned and coordinated campaign of mass killings. The Department of State under Rex Tillerson called it ethnic cleansing. The House of Representatives went further and called it genocide in a bipartisan vote. Yet, for the past year or more, we haven't heard anything. What more is the U.S. government waiting for?
Well, the only way to address a challenge of this magnitude is if the most powerful governments of the world make it a high priority. The United States has not. China certainly has not.
But what more should they do? I mean, should they call it genocide? Would you call it genocide?
Well, I think at a minimum, the government of the United States should be calling out crimes against humanity, which would be a very significant and substantial action. I think there are indications of genocide that have taken place, but it's a far clearer case to be made that crimes against humanity have taken place, and it's inexplicable to me why the United States of America, as after doing that report, was not prepared to call out the military in Myanmar for crimes against humanity.
So you would simply call it crimes against humanity. You wouldn't call it genocide, even though the United Nations has.
I think there is. I think there is enough evidence that a case for genocide, should be made against the authorities in Myanmar. There is no question in my mind that widespread crimes against humanity took place. And again, I don't understand why Washington has been unprepared to say that to date.
All right, well, when you look at the numbers of refugees that the United States is taking in, obviously the numbers have been cut drastically. This past year, the US took 3,081 refugees from Myanmar, the second highest number after the DRC, followed by Ukraine, Bhutan, and Eritrea. It isn't just the numbers that have been cut so significantly, it's also where these refugees come from. There seems to have been a concerted effort to take fewer refugees from Muslim-majority countries. Would you agree?
I believe the implementation of these programs have been unfairly biased against refugee applicants from Muslim-majority countries. And it's done, through the argument of, security screening, but I think I think it does not serve the United States of America well. It does not serve us well in terms of humanitarian values. It doesn't serve the United States of America well in terms of U.S. foreign policy and national security interests around the world as well. A refugee program should be focused on the most vulnerable.
The prevalent narrative, though, and you just alluded to it, is that refugees are more likely to be terrorist recruits. Is that borne by the data?
It's not borne by the data. Let me stipulate, though, having run the U.S. refugee program, there's no question that there are serious and substantial security issues involved in the processing of refugees. There are, but they're not insurmountable issues. They don't have to result in a plummeting of refugee resettlement from a particular ethnic or religious group. Since 9/11, there's not one case of a refugee, a resettled refugee being responsible for an act of violence a terrorist act of violence that resulted in the loss of an American life. And that's a pretty significant statistic.
And to this point, in a study released by the Cato Institute, the likelihood of being killed on U.S. soil by a refugee was 1 in 3.86 billion. Yeah. So clearly, when the President of the United States talks about dangerous criminals and unknown Middle Easterners at the southern border, Does that help the situation?
No,
What evidence is he relying on?
And look, you're
what evidence does
articulating-
he rely on?
He's not relying on evidence, any evidence of which I am aware, about problems of Middle East-related terrorists at the southern border. But let me also be, you're articulating to me what in many respects are self-evident facts. I mean, this is the challenge that we have with the current administration, and it's significant, it's substantial, it's unfortunate, and advocacy organizations like mine do everything we can to inject facts and evidence into the discussion and the debate.
But how troubling is it for you, though, as a senior former State Department official, to see the way the hardline policies towards immigrants and refugees within this administration by the likes of Jared Kushner and Stephen Miller, both of whom are descendants of asylum seekers and refugees? How troubling is it for you to hear them say it doesn't matter if we do or do not take in refugees?
Let me answer the question personally, if I may. If you're asking me how troubling are some of these stories and reports, or all of these stories and reports, they're very troubling. They're the reason I wake up in the morning and do refugee advocacy and trying to, I'm confident. Look, these issues go in ebbs and flows in our country and in every country. And if I weren't optimistic, if I didn't think that better instincts would prevail in this struggle, I wouldn't be in this work.
And so what is the role when you look at this issue on a more global front? You yourself have signed a letter addressed to the Secretary of State a couple of years ago, along with many other national security officials and diplomats, urging the United States to hold on to its traditional role of showing generosity towards refugees, saying that this is an important tool of U.S. foreign policy. Does Congress need to jump in? Is there a role for Congress that it has abdicated so far?
Let me talk about Congress with respect to overseas humanitarian aid, because the United States traditionally has provided anywhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of total international humanitarian assistance. The United States is now at about $9 billion. And the Trump administration and the president has proposed cuts of 30%. The latest proposal is a cut from about $9 billion to under $6 billion. And Congress, thankfully, has resisted those cuts. So at least with respect to U.S. overseas assistance and contributing to the multilateral effort to respond to cases like the situation in Bangladesh, the Congress has helped to hold the line, and that's a very important thing. It also reflects the fact that the United States is not just the President of the United States.
Eric Schwartz, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So as the U.S. scales back its admission of refugees, the rest of the world is trying to find a home for the growing population of displaced people. Katie Fisher takes a look at the global picture with this week's 5 Facts.
Over 25 million people have left their country, fleeing persecution, violence, or war, and the global need for resettlement is rising. 57% of these refugees come from 3 countries: South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Syria. 85% of refugees are hosted in developing countries. Worldwide, Turkey, Uganda, and Pakistan have taken in the most refugees. But relative to each country's population, Lebanon and Jordan host the most refugees per capita. 1 in 4 people is a refugee in Lebanon and 1 in 3 in Jordan. In 2018, fewer than 56,000 of the 1.2 million refugees in need of resettlement were actually resettled. That's less than 5% of the global need. And although those numbers are rising, this year the U.S. plans to take in fewer refugees than ever. Throughout the Bush and Obama presidencies, the annual refugee admissions cap was between 70 to 80,000, but the actual number of people admitted into the U.S. was far lower. Obama increased the ceiling to 110,000 for 2017, but when President Trump took office, he lowered the admissions cap to 50,000 per year. He has continued to cut the rate of acceptance, bringing resettlement down by 73% since 2016. The cap for 2019 is 30,000, the lowest since the resettlement program was introduced. Meanwhile, in Europe, the number of people seeking refuge has declined over the past 4 years. In 2015, over 1 million people sought refuge in Europe. Since then, that number has declined significantly to just over 500,000 in 2018.
Staggering statistics, no doubt, but the humanitarian need is real. What should the major global powers do to lessen the load on developing nations? Is it just not their problem? And how important is it for the US to lead the way? To discuss, I'm joined by Boian, spokesperson for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and Sam Witten, former Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees and Migration under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He is also a former State Department Deputy Legal Advisor. Sam Witten, looking at the situation here in the United States first, the situation at the southern border, although refugees around the world are facing increasingly difficult circumstances, when you look at the way asylum seekers have been pushed back, held in detention, do you think, from a legal perspective at least, that it does or does not contravene international humanitarian law?
I think there's a real crisis at our southern border, and it has been perpetuated in large part by a lack of legal services for those who are being held at the border. In the United States, a criminal defendant has the right to court-appointed counsel, but those seeking asylum, those in immigration detention, do not have that right. And I think one of the biggest challenges for the United States is to be sure that those who are being held at the border know their rights, have the ability to have counsel who can help them navigate through what in the United States is a very complicated immigration situation.
Sure, but is this U.S. policy of turning people away at the border, people who are fleeing violence and persecution, consistent with international humanitarian law?
Well, my perspective is that the U.S. has an obligation to hear people out. If they have a claim of persecution in their home countries and they cannot go back there safely, they have a right to ask the United States for protection.
Chris Boian, UNHCR does not operate here in the United States, but throughout the world. To what extent do you feel that there should be more of a responsibility that should be borne by developed nations as opposed to the first responders, the countries that these refugees in the region, if it's the Middle East region, first go to?
Around 86% of the world's refugees live in and are hosted by some of the world's poorest countries. And most refugees choose to stay as close as they can to their homes with a view to returning to their homes when it's safe for them to do so and they can do so in dignity. So it is important for all of the countries of the world, the richest countries of the world, of course, the middle income countries of the world, to support those that are on the front lines and that really are shouldering the bulk of responsibility for responding to and assisting the human beings that have been forced to flee violence in their home countries.
But a lot of these countries are facing breaking point. I mean, taking in so many refugees, in the case of Turkey, 3.6 million, in the case of Lebanon and Jordan, a huge number as well. That is clearly putting a strain, a socio-economic and political strain on these countries. Can they continue to bear the brunt of the refugee influx?
They can't continue to do what they've been doing and to show the kinds of generosity they have shown now for a number of years without support from the international community. And that's one of the things that UNHCR talks about in every forum and with every government in the world, that this is the responsibility really of all countries acting in concert to support those that are hosting most refugees.
So you mentioned the responsibility of the international community. Sam Witten, who within the international community should we turn to? Because I know that when you were Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees and Migration under Bush and Obama, you traveled the world. You went to countries like Iraq and Jordan, asking them to take in more refugees. But today, when the US has the lowest ceiling for refugee admissions in its history, can it convincingly ask others to do more?
I think that's a great question. I've been very disappointed with the current administration reduction in refugee admissions. It has only bad consequences, as far as I can tell, in terms of the tens of thousands of people that are not being admitted for protection in the United States that would have been and had been in a bipartisan manner for all of those years. And I think that the U.S. persuasiveness internationally to get other countries to admit refugees for protection under their admissions program is inherently diminished if we cannot say we're taking 85,000, 90,000, whatever the number is. And I think that this administration's reduction in that number has not has been unfortunate and has not been productive for the United States internationally.
Chris Boian, when you look at this issue on a more global level, and when you see the political cost that some of the wealthiest nations in Europe have had to pay politically for the resettlement of refugees, how much does the reluctance to accept more refugees have to do with this misconception that migrants and refugees are almost the same thing?
Well, I think you hit on a very important point, and that is the misconception that refugees a very specific type of person on the move, and migrants in general are interchangeable terms. They're really not. When we're talking about refugees, we are talking about people who really have no choice but to flee their country of habitual residence, their home countries, to escape war and persecution and violence.
But it doesn't help when the United Nations convenes a summit, as it did a couple of years ago in New York, conflating the issue. It was a summit on refugees and migrants. That doesn't help the picture either.
Well, those are two different words, and I'm not sure that that conflated the issue, because we addressed very specifically the questions of refugees per se, and that launched a process then that ended up resulting in something called the Global Compact on Refugees, which really is a fundamentally new paradigm about responding to refugees specifically.
Refugee situations often begin as very temporary situations, but as we know, they really drag on sometimes for decades. The plight of Palestinian refugees comes to mind. I know it is not under the scope of UNHCR, it is under the scope of the UN agency UNRWA. Nonetheless, the US administration decided to cut all funding for 5 million refugees that UNRWA was taking care of. As a former State Department official, how do you view this? Is it in the interest of the United States, even Israel's, to do this?
That's a very good question. I did not agree with this administration's decision to cut off funding to UNRWA. It was done very suddenly, and even though the United States had been involved for many years in trying to build even greater international support, the US decision not to fund UNRWA was a shock to the system. In the Middle East. I know that UNRWA has worked very hard to find replacement funding, but I think US leadership through the years with respect to UNRWA has been very important, has been pretty basic to having a successful protection of those many Palestinians in UNRWA facilities in the 5 areas where UNRWA operates.
There seems to be a sort of fatigue that has kicked in every time we talk about refugees, certainly when we talk about Palestinian refugees. But there are refugee populations, Chris Boian, around the world that have been simply forgotten. The plight of the Sahrawis, the refugees from Western Sahara, comes to mind. They've been languishing in very harsh desert conditions for more than 40 years, 4 decades. I know there was a recent census made by UNHCR that found the numbers to be about 170,000 people. I myself visited one of these camps. I saw the kind of conditions they live in. Why isn't UNHCR, though, doing more to highlight the plight of the Sahrawi refugees? Is it because of political pressures that you face or something else?
You make a very good point. You know, very few people understand that 4 in 5 refugees in the world today has been a refugee for at least 5 years. And 1 in 5 refugees has been a refugee for at least 20 years. And so these are situations, and these are the kinds of situations we refer to as protracted refugee situations that aren't resolved overnight. They are chronic, they require constant attention. We're talking about human beings, and large numbers of human beings who have been forcibly uprooted from their homes and that require attention and support.
But more specifically, though, why is the world so selective? Why are international organizations like yours selective in the kind of attention it gives to certain refugees and what it doesn't give to others?
You know, Ghida, as a matter of principle, we're not selective in terms of our responses to refugees around the world. If you look at our staff and our operations around the world, we're in the field where the refugees are, including the situations that you referred to in other places in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and in the Americas now as well. And that, our focus is always on the human beings and being with them on the front lines. What is capturing the headlines on any given day may change, but our focus is always on refugees in the field.
So you have a lot of young people languishing in these refugee camps without any hope. What is the solution in the absence of any kind of long-term resettlement back to their homes, if there is one to speak of? And how much of a concern is it that the situation and the hopelessness that they live within could actually turn into some kind of powder keg?
I think the situation you mentioned is highlighted by Dadaab, which is the large refugee set of camps in Kenya, where hundreds of thousands of Somalis have been for years. Many children grow up in that camp, and the hope can easily be lost, and anger can easily build among these populations. I think that the ideal solution for a refugee situation is return to their country of nationality. In a situation like that, it's not realistic. Integration into Kenya has always been a real challenge. So the issue is what to do pending, ideally, resettlement or integration. In order to avoid these children growing up without hope, they need education and skills training. And I think that's one of the most pressing needs internationally for refugees.
Just to add to what Sam said, 1 in every 2 refugees in the world is a child.
And that really puts it in context. Chris Boian and Sam Witten, thank you both very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And so while there are more refugees in the world and fewer countries willing to take them in, the political backlash is making their dire situation even worse. And as long as many continue to see them as statistics, security threats, or financial burdens, the global response to the plight of refugees will continue to be dictated by populist rhetoric rather than principled policies and international law. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.